that should stretch from the early years and Key Stage 1 to Key Stage 5 and beyond. And I love that metaphor of an ecosystem. It speaks of notions of growth and fecundity and cross-pollination that are relevant to the development of children and young people and us as teachers and teacher educators. We should all be part of that beautiful complexity. However, the manifesto warns that significant damage is being caused to that ecosystem, caused at least in part by the current national curriculum for English and its attendant assessment and accountability frameworks, including the fixed key stage structures, and that they suggest the ecosystem is being jeopardised as a result. Well, with perfect timing, the Curriculum and Assessment Review, led by Becky Francis, that will lead towards the next national curriculum, an interim report on that was published just yesterday. So we're absolutely in the sweet spot. I've only had a chance to skim read that so far, but it did strike me on page 6, a reference to this point, quote, "We consider that the present architecture of key stages is broadly working well, and we intend to recommend retaining it." So that's the news hot off the Curriculum and Assessment Interim Report press. Now, our speakers this afternoon are all inspired, directly or indirectly, by their place within the English ecosystem and the tensions that they find there, particularly in relation to reading and literacy between and across the key stages. So I'm delighted that we're going to hear this afternoon from Sarah Brownsword from the University of East Anglia, and she will draw on her doctoral research focusing on primary teachers' awareness of racial diversity in the fiction texts they teach, and she's going to make some recommendations for practice on the back of that. And that will be followed by Tara Glauch and Kalpa Galani of the University of the West of England, and they will discuss the use of non-fiction texts about tree cover in urban settings at both Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, and how that can be used to develop young people's eco and social critical literacy skills. And then finally, last but very much not least, Beth Kemp from Nottingham Trent University. She will draw on her doctoral research to problematise the reading experience for post-16 students forced to resit GCSE English language in FE and the impact this has on students' reading identities. Sorry, okay. So each of the presentations is going to last about 12 minutes, and we're going to go straight into the presentations in a moment. And then the presenters will follow each other one after the other. Once we've had the 3 presentations, the 4 presenters will have an opportunity to be in dialogue with each other and pick up themselves on anything of pertinent from each other's presentations, and that will be followed by questions that we in the audience can ask, and you're free to ask a question either through the chat or by putting up your hand and unmuting yourself, and you can ask your question directly. The session is going to be recorded, so Garvin, thank you very much for being ready to press record. So just be mindful of that in the interactions that you participate in. We will close by 6 o'clock, I promise, and there will be an opportunity then I hope there'll be an opportunity for us to think about further dialogue within this English in Education SIG. So please, could I ask you to keep your mics muted until it is time for questions so that we don't interrupt the presenters. And I will now hand over to Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lorna. Right, I'm just going to be quiet while I share my presentation and then I'll speak. Otherwise, I can't do 2 things at once. Okay, hopefully you can all see that on the screen now. So yeah, thank you all for being here. It's really great to be able to come and present to you. So I'm just going to start off with a bit of an introduction. And then I'm going to move on and talk about my research. So as Lorna said, my name's Sarah Brownsword and I work at the University of East Anglia, where I'm course director for the primary PGCE. If you don't know the University of East Anglia, it's in Norwich, which is in Norfolk. And Norfolk is a predominantly white area, and this is relevant to what I'm going to talk about. So the population of Norfolk is around 95% white, and around the same percentage, 95%, speak English as their first language. There is very limited diversity in the area that that we're teaching in, and that the teachers, lots of the teachers in my research were living in as well. So on the PGCE, I lead English and primary languages as well. And I'm also the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Lead for the School of Education and Lifelong Learning at UEA. And I'm going to talk to you about my research on representation in children's literature, as Lorna mentioned. So this research came out of my interest in children's literature and my interest in anti-racist education. And as we know, reading is a fundamental skill that's learned in primary schools. And it's important as an end in itself, but it's also really important to enable children to access the rest of the curriculum for the rest of their learning lives. And we know that it's important to engage children in reading from a young age, and that representation is a big part of that. So representation is important in children's books because children need books that reflect their own experiences. They also need books that introduce them to new experiences, and that's particularly relevant in the predominantly white area that I live in. And then children also need books that will encourage them to step into new perspectives. So in this session, I'm going to share with you some of the findings of my recent doctoral research. So for this research, which is called An Exploration of Representation of Racially Minoritized Characters in Children's Books in UK Primary Schools, I did a questionnaire with primary teachers asking them about the books that they were using in schools. So I asked general questions about the books, but I also specifically asked them about the books that featured characters from racially minoritized backgrounds. And I also did interviews with teachers as well. So a questionnaire and then follow up with interviews. And at the end of the questionnaire and interviews, I had a list of 90 books featuring racially minoritized characters that the teachers had named. So I took the ones that were most frequently mentioned by the teachers, and I did some in-depth analysis of those books using an analytical framework that I created to produce narrative summaries of the books. So I'm not going to focus on the analysis of these books today. I'm going to focus on some of the other findings of my research. But the books that I focused on were the books that are on the screen there. So there were 7 picture books: Hand of Surprise, Look Up, Ruby's Worry, My Hair, Julian is a Mermaid, and Bold Women in Black History, and The Proudest Blue. And then there were 4 novels: The Boy at the Back of the Class, Cloud Busting, High Rise Mystery, and Holes. So one of the questions that I asked participants was the location that they were teaching in, so that I was able then to analyse the data from my locally predominantly white area separately from the data from teachers that were teaching in other areas. And one of the things that I found were that teachers in the predominantly white area were 3 times less likely to be using books that were featuring racially minoritized characters than the teachers in other areas. But not only that, where they were using them, they were most likely to feature Black or South Asian characters. So there was a lack of diversity in general, but then there was also a lack of diversity within the diversity. So Black characters and South Asian characters were represented, but not characters from other ethnicities. So yeah, lack of diversity, but also a lack of diversity within the diversity. Another of the findings were that there were a lot of misconceptions around author ethnicity. So, for example, teachers presumed that if a book featured a character from a minoritized background, the author was also from the same background. So on the slide, there's 3 examples of this. So all 3 of these authors, Tom Percival, Eileen Brown, and Jessica Love, were misidentified as being Black by several of the teachers who took part in my questionnaire. And these weren't the only ones. There were other authors that were misidentified as well. And what was interesting about that list were that all of the authors who were misidentified were writing about Black characters. It didn't happen with authors that were writing about other ethnicities. So I think there's something that needs to be kind of unpicked and explored further in this. when it comes to the kind of misidentification of authors. So some of the books that I analysed were really good examples of books that you could use to discuss race and ethnicity and also racism with children. So, for example, The Proudest Blue is a story of a girl's first time wearing her hijab to school, and she experiences bullying. The Boy at the Back of the Class is a story of a refugee child who joins a UK school from Syria, and he experiences bullying. And in Holes, you've got the two different timelines with the historical racism alongside the present day experiences of a black boy in the judicial system in the US. So all of these books could be used to discuss those issues of racism by teachers. But what came across in my research, particularly in the interviews, was that teachers really lacked the confidence and the skills to use the books to discuss racism. They were aware that books were a good way of doing that. They could name the books that they thought would be good for doing that, but they didn't know how to have those conversations with children. They didn't know how to support children in having those discussions. So my question there is, where is the CPD for this? Where is the training for this for teachers? There are lots of places where teachers can go and find lists of diverse books. There are websites dedicated to showing teachers where the diverse books are, but often there is nothing to go with these lists of books, and teachers actually need training to be able to do this. Otherwise, they don't really know how to have those conversations. The majority of teachers, I think it was about 93% of the teachers in my research, were using social media for book recommendations. So they talked about things like Facebook groups for recommending books. They were using Instagram, teacher book accounts, but there was little evidence of criticality. So, for example, if a book was recommended in one of these online spaces, the teachers would just presume that it was an appropriate book to use, or it was okay to use with their children. So one of the teachers that I interviewed gave the example of this book that's on the screen being recommended in a Facebook group to a Key Stage 2 teacher. So the Key Stage 2 teacher had asked, I want a book to read alongside teaching about Islam, and somebody recommended this book, The Architect's Apprentice. Now, The Architect's Apprentice is not a children's book. It's a completely unsuitable recommendation to read with a Key Stage 2 class. So there was a real lack of criticality around the information that teachers were getting from social media. Lots of teachers who took part in the research told me that they were using English schemes or book spines that prescribed what books they had to use in their teaching of English. And this is becoming more and more common in primary schools. 10, 15 years ago, it was actually quite unusual for schools to be using schemes, and now more and more schools are using them. So there's two examples on there, which are the Write Stuff and Talk for Writing. These were the most common ones that were mentioned to me by the teachers in my research, but there were others that were mentioned as well. And many of the teachers felt really restricted by this when it came to book choice. So you can see there's a quote there that demonstrates this. This was from a Year 2 teacher in a Norfolk school who said, some of us are still fighting to supplement and change this to include authors and books that fit our cohort needs, new publishers and so forth. This freedom to select for ourselves is diminishing constantly. So teachers really felt like, although they might need that structure of a scheme, they were losing their autonomy of choice of what text that they were using from day to day. So one of the things that I also explore in my thesis is intersectionality. So particularly thinking about gender. So traditionally, boys have been overrepresented in children's literature and girls have been underrepresented, although this has improved more recently. And I read an interview recently with Dapo Adiola, who's the illustrator of the book Look Up, which is one of the books that I talk about in my research. And he was saying that when he was a child, the only books where he saw his own ethnicity represented, he's a black man, the only books when he was a child where he saw his own ethnicity represented were Hand of Surprise and Amazing Grace, both books that feature black girls. So he struggled himself to find black boys represented in books when he was a child. And when I look at the list of picture books that came up in my research, I can't help but wonder, where are all the boys? Because all of these books, apart from one of them, features a girl as a main character. And the one that does feature a boy as a main character, Julian is a mermaid. He's a boy that wants to dress up as a girl. So there was a real lack of boys, particularly within the picture books. I didn't see this in the novels. The boys were represented in novels, but they were missing from the picture books. So I think that this highlights a problem with representation in children's earliest experiences of reading, particularly for boys. So now that I've finished this research, I'm kind of thinking about what it might be useful to do next with it. So as I mentioned, I created an analytical framework as part of this research that explores representation. So one of the things that I would like to do next is some impact case studies using the framework with teachers, but also some work around this that captures children's voice around representation, because that was something that I didn't include in my research that I think would be a really good thing to do, and actually find out what children really think about this. And my research was focused on looking at representation of non-white ethnicities, but we know that one of the most underperforming groups in schools are Gypsy, Roma and Traveller children, who are often very problematically represented in children's literature. So I think that research around that is really important. So you can see there, they're often, where they are represented, it's exotic and mysterious or tragic and trapped. And it's rare to see well-rounded, culturally sensitive representation. And then finally, there's been a huge rise in children's books published recently, which represent the refugee experience. So I did explore one of those, The Boy at the Buck of the Class, in my research. But there's been a huge kind of influx of books around refugee experiences recently. Some of them actually are really problematic in the way that they represent a kind of good country, bad country dichotomy, or have a kind of white saviour element to them. So I think more research into the representation of refugees needs to be done in children's literature as well. So finally, just to leave you with my references and my email address as well, and just to say thank you for listening, and yeah, look forward to your questions later on.
Thank you, Sarah. Gosh, that was fantastic. What a brilliant way to start our afternoon. Really, really inspiring. Lots of ideas there, and I've got plenty of notes for questions already, but we'll hold those because it's now time to welcome Kalpa and Tara to follow up. So over to you.
Thanks for that, Sarah. I thought that was great. And actually, there's a lot of crossover, so I'm quite excited now to present this, and then we can talk after. So Kalpa and I both work at the University of the West of England. I'm a secondary specialist. Kalpa is a primary specialist. So we're just going to take turns as we go through this presentation. Now, this looks really specific from the perspective of trees, but really what we're talking about is how we speak to children about nature when we use nonfiction texts. So we're developing students' eco and social critical literacies with these nonfiction texts. And we're going to tell you a little bit today about the context of Bristol and how we localize this, how we foreground context, and then how we use these texts, these nonfiction texts in primary and secondary to open up these literacies and these conversations. So first of all, to dive into context here, I think with Bristol, there's this perception that Bristol is actually a very green city, and we come up in awards, eco awards, and I think we have this this kind of reputation of being a sort of this idyllic place for people that are very eco-minded. But actually, the truth is very, very different. It's actually a lot more complex than that. It depends on where you live. So if you live up on the hill in Clifton, and you come from privilege, then what you are surrounded by is what you see on the left, which is a really kind of iconic Bristol image of the bridge and also of the Clifton Downs. But actually, where I live and where a lot of the kids that we teach come from is around Lawrence Hill. And just to give you an idea about Lawrence Hill, it's about 47% free school meals, and it's also got far less tree cover than the families that actually live in Clifton. So it's a very segregated city in terms of wealth disparity, but also in terms of ethnicity, and also in terms of tree cover. Because what we find in neighborhoods like Lawrence Hill and Barton Hill is we have an overrepresentation of Black and brown families. And then in Clifton, we have an overrepresentation of white families. Now, what's interesting about this is that also when we think about what an environmentalist looks like in the media. What we have on the left here is when Greta Thunberg came to Bristol to march, and this got a lot of press coverage. And what you see are a lot of white faces. And this isn't actually representative of what goes on in Bristol. Actually, we had for several years a brilliant program called Black and Green Ambassadors that was spearheaded by the Bristol City Council and Ujima Radio, where they tried to combat this misrepresentation with Black and brown people that were ambassadors for green policy in Bristol, and especially around tree cover and access to green spaces. So this is something that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about eco-literacies, is representation in these spaces and how this is communicated to kids. A little bit more on that in a second. So when we are actually broaching these topics, we have to keep in mind this context in our city. So we have to keep in mind some of the risks. So when we are actually introducing some of the news texts and the nonfiction texts around these issues in Bristol, around the confluence of social justice and environmental justice in Bristol, we've got a few dangers we might come into contact with. I think the first thing is the enormity and the complexity of the problem, which just exacerbates climate anxiety in a group of students that are already experiencing unprecedented levels of mental health issues. And this, again, there's an overrepresentation of Black and brown students within this group. So we have to be particularly mindful of racially minoritized students when we talk about this. Also, the scale of the problems, students' dependence on parents that have to make choices around driving or where they live as well. And this feeling sometimes that can come up of complicity in unsustainable food, energy, and transportation industries. And what that can do is engender in students a feeling of futility and apathy. We also risk positioning racially minoritized students as passive victims. And I think, in Sarah's presentation, I think that's some of the problematized issues that were coming up around refugees and how refugees are represented. So we have to think about actually representing racially minoritized students accurately by showing them empowered activists. The other danger here is framing humans as the villain and nature as the victim. So I think this is a really, really problematic thing, because actually that just further exacerbates that feeling of apathy and powerlessness. We miss this opportunity to recognize our place in nature and actually build on our symbiotic relationship, and actually seeing nature, and we're going to talk about trees specifically, as an ally in the fight for environmental and social justice. And I think one really nice example I'd like to share with you about this is Mike Feingold, who's absolutely wonderful. So what Mike Feingold did in the 80s is, when we were moving from the post-World War II kind of digging for Britain thing, where we had allotments and people were sharing allotments in communities and growing food, is we had this move to a globalized food industry where we were starting to ship in most of our food. And so a lot of these allotments weren't getting used as much as they used to. And although the space was still really valuable, developers had their eye on it. And so they were offering Bristol City Council millions of pounds to buy this land. Now, Mike Feingold knew that this was very short-term thinking. So what he did really cleverly is he started guerrilla planting fruit trees all over. And legally, if there are trees that are producing fruit that the community are using, then developers actually can't use that land. So it was really good. And he did that in the 80s. This is still running today. This is him a few years ago. And actually, this is still a space that families that struggle with food security can actually use to have fresh food. And it's also a hub for the community. And you can just see a quote here from him about his vision for doing this. I'll give you a chance to read it. So this idea of activism that's really effective and has a huge impact over decades for that whole community. And I think what that does is it really combats those four issues and those four dangers that I presented before. So if we look locally and we think about representation, we think about empowering representation and that allyship between people and trees, I think that puts us in a much better position as educators. So now I'm going to hand over to Kalpit to talk about the primary perspective.
Thanks, Tara. Right, so my role today is really to talk about the primary perspective and how we can use non-fictional texts for our children, but also to think about how we're supporting our pre-service teachers as well in managing this themselves. So we begin our relationship with nature really early in our childhood, and one of the things that I'm considering here is our relation, or our role as educators and how we nurture this kind of innate curiosity. So even if I just think anecdotally, when I'm going into schools and I'm seeing our pre-service teachers teaching and watching things that are going on in the classroom, I'm seeing very few children outdoors during lessons. Everything's quite contained in the classroom. And if we think back to, what Sarah was saying about schemes coming into schools, that's also playing a really big part in classroom culture. So really, this is just thinking about how we can consider outdoor learning and that sort of aspects of nature and bringing that more into the forefront of our practice, really. And some key things that I'm going to talk about today really is pedagogies of hope. That's kind of the thing that drives some of the things that I'm going to be talking about. And you can see there, I've got a few key aspects. So thinking about education for sustainability. So we're really discussing here that emphasis on, how do we teach our students about environmental stewardship? How do we teach them about sustainable practices and equip them really with knowledge and skills that they're going to need to address some of these global and environmental challenges that will be coming up in the future? We'll have a look at interdisciplinary approaches as well, and thinking about, how do we use some of these approaches in a critical way so that if we think back to sort of Paulo Freire's work, we're really looking at sort of empowering students to question those societal norms and any injustices, and then thinking about how they can be those active agents of change. Thanks, Tara. Now you can move on to the next slide. So I wanted to really just introduce you, if you haven't seen these books already, to a couple of non-fiction texts that I think are just absolutely gorgeous. So the first one is The Wonder of Trees, and this is by Nicola Davies, and it's illustrated by Lorna Scobie. And it really looks at the diversity of trees and their relationships with other organisms. So Lorna's theme of the ecosystem that you spoke about, Lorna, at the beginning kind of is continuing in this presentation, coincidentally. And in this book, there's a real awareness and appreciation of the importance of trees in various ecosystems, and it encourages young readers to sort of explore and appreciate, I guess, the value of the need for conservation. So there's a sort of a real showcasing of diversity of tree species, their contributions, and I guess, fostering this sort of global citizenship and environmental stewardship. And alongside that goes that idea of symbiotic relationships. So there's lots of discussion around ecological interactions, thinking about how trees provide habitats, food, protection, mutual benefits of these, and also thinking about forest communities, those organisms that are coexisting together. And some of the activities we might consider incorporating in our classrooms for children are things like a tree diary project where they're creating observations, they're recording things, they're using their voice through narrative, through poetry, through oracy to develop some of these relationships that they have with the world around them. Thanks, Terry. Okay, to move to slide 3 for me, please. Thank you. And then the next book that I thought was just really lovely is Under the Canopy. And this is a beautiful book that really highlights cultural significance of trees. So it promotes that global citizenship and environmental equity. And there's a few examples that I've put here on this slide to come and demonstrate that a little bit more. So the first thing I wanted to speak about this book in particular was the cultural significance of trees. And the book really highlights these kind of the importance of trees in various cultures. It talks about olive trees in Athens. It talks about eucalyptus trees in Australia. One of the examples I've put here actually is the cherry tree, the sakura in Japan, and the importance of that heritage and cultural values for that tree specifically. But also the historical context of trees. So there's the other example, the big picture that you can see on the slide about the elm tree. And I thought there's just one beautiful line in this, and it starts off with, the land was still free when an elm sapling took root. and it sort of journeys the tree growing whilst the city of Boston in the US is also growing. And then there's the uprising against the British colonial rule, and the tree is there throughout that whole thing. And I just think there's so much to unpick just from that one line alone, let alone the rest of that page. So there's just so much we can do with that. And I think ultimately, the message that I really want to get across through this is, how can we use Freire's pedagogies of hope to really think about that coexistence and symbiotic relationship with nature, and also enable our pre-service teachers to see that potential to influence the positive change moving forward, and creating some of that cohesive and progressive learning experiences moving forward. Over to you, Tara.
Thank you. Kalpa slides are much nicer than mine, just a warning. Okay, so first I want to be really pragmatic here, because as secondary teachers, we are beholden to the GCSE. And I think it's really important to couch what we talk about in, the nitty-gritty reality of, we need to meet these assessment objectives. So if we look at, in my opinion, the toughest exam that students sit is language paper 2. And the nonfiction texts that they have to look at are looked at in comparison. So for assessment objective 3, it's to compare writers' ideas and perspectives. That's really key. And how these perspectives are conveyed across 2 or more texts. And I think it's really important to note that actually in the examiner report, what came back was that higher ability students were able to make comparisons about writers' perspectives, such as the connection they portrayed between humans and nature when they were, students that were responding to this text that was actually about somebody camping in the rain. The students that did the best were able to elevate that to talk about, our relationship with nature. So not just something about camping in the rain and that being uncomfortable. So they were able to think about it within a conceptual framework. So what we're doing here is we're doing something really important by teaching kids about, eco-literacy and also that confluence of social and environmental justice, but we're giving them that conceptual framework. So that confidence to go into an exam, deal with unseen texts, and have a really confident personal response with an idea leading it all the way through. So that's really key. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of texts that I used when I was still in school and that I've passed on to my trainees as well. So the first one I highly recommend to highlight that confluence of social and environmental justice is a chapter from The Hidden Life of Trees, really popular book, but it's called Street Kids. And what this chapter does is it talks about the trees that we plant in the street as if they were street kids. And there's a lot of similarities here. So first of all, he points out that street trees are grown separately from a supportive network. So just like what Kalpa was talking about, in nature, in the forest, as you probably know by now, trees are always communicating with each other. They're sharing resources underground through a fungal network. Now, when they're actually planted in the street, they don't have that. They're actually very isolated. They don't have a forest floor where they're actually getting loads of decaying leaves and logs and all that kind of stuff. They're paved right over, as you can see in this picture. So they're actually starved of community and they're starved of resources. And all they have is that soil underground where they have very limited access to water and any new nutrients that are coming in. So because of that, they have a lot shorter lifespans because of these harsh conditions that they have to live in. So what he actually does in this chapter is he uses very emotive language to convey this perspective. So from the perspective of trees, what it's actually like to grow up as a street kid, as a street tree. And I think what this does is it actually draws on our experience of walking past unhoused young people every day on our way to work, to actually think about that and the feelings we have about that, and actually think about how trees are having a very similar experience. And what I found from using this with both secondary students and my trainee teachers is that they're really overwhelmed, emotionally overwhelmed by this realization of what it's like for a street tree. The other thing I want to bring up here, and this is in relation to, I think this harks back to what Sarah was talking about in terms of GRT communities, is actually there's a beautiful book that I think is a great representation by Jana Elliott. And Jana Elliott, she's from a Romani Gypsy community, and what she did is go around and collect oral stories. and then write those up in a book of loads of vignettes and short stories. And I think there's a couple in there. I mean, they're all great, but there's a couple that are particularly good for Key Stage 3. And one in particular that I loved was Liljana's List. And it's told from the perspective of a young girl who's fleeing a pogrom. And this is a roundabout in Serbia, but it doesn't give dates and sort of national borders. The story repeatedly references plum trees as sources of art, food, and music. So just like Kalpa was talking about, this link between trees and culture and how intertwined our lives are with trees. So they're essential to the cultural life of the village's people. But there's a lot of imagery because the plums are like blood on the ground. So there's a lot of imagery where it's actually through the eyes of a young girl, but she's describing what's happening to the trees and the violence that's happening to the trees as a sort of proxy for the violence that's happening to the people. So it softens it through the lens of talking about trees, but we know what's going on. So I'm just going to give you a chance to read this quote underneath those 2 bullet points. And what this young girl's, what's happening to this young girl is she's just been told that they're going to have to leave her forever home, or what she thought was a forever home. So they're forced to move on in this situation. And this is her way of communicating that this is something that's going to affect her whole life, that she's going to have that scar on her whole life as she goes, as she remembers this experience. So I think those 2 texts and the text that Kalpa and the text that Kalpa was talking about as well leaves us with a few takeaways here. So first of all, we might get challenged with this idea of, trees aren't people and that anthropomorphism is silly. It's not silly at all. Actually, we share a significant portion of our DNA with trees. We owe many of our evolved characteristics, food, art, technology, and medicine to them as well. And teaching allyship with trees and the natural world in general is really key to the pedagogies of hope that Kalpa was talking about. It offers up this opportunity for an interdisciplinary approach and lateral thinking. So connections between social and environmental justice comes up when we use this interdisciplinary approach. I think a really key thing here is building up students' critical literacies. So challenging narratives that position, first of all, humans as villain consumers and nature just as this resource for exploitation and this victim. But also positioning racially minoritized people as non-agential victims when we talk about environmental issues, when we talk about social justice, when we talk about environmental justice. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to any questions that come up.
Fabulous. Thank you so much to Tara and to Kalpa for, again, an equally inspiring and stimulating presentation as Sarah's. And yes, there was lovely synergies between them in terms of the Gypsy Roman Traveller people specifically, but I'm really interested in the binaries. There's a theme of binaries that's coming out between the presentations, and maybe that's something we can pick up later. So thank you so much. And Beth, I think, is ready in the wings and ready to talk about the Key Stage 5 experience. Thank you, Beth.
Sorry, just trying to with my slides there. Can we see them? Okay, great. All right, so I'm speaking about sorry, the FE learner perspective, and I'm doing that with 2 hats on really. So I teach in an FE college in Leicester, which in contrast to Sarah in particular is very diverse, and I'm also conducting a PhD at Nottingham Trent Uni, where I'm researching young people's perspectives on diversity in their reading, particularly in context of the GCSE in English. Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to show you was a set of data that I gleaned from my interviews. So all of these are comments that young people made in the interviews, and what this is all one theme, the theme of sameness and repetition. So I was surprised by some of these comments. I expected young people to tell me that the books that they were reading for GCSE literature were similar, but I didn't expect them to tell me that they were reading the literal same texts year after year. Looking at the bottom left there, that's a comment from one of my participants, Ariko. I'm using pseudonyms. He told me that he read Romeo and Juliet 3 years in a row, starting in Key Stage 3. So yeah, I'm sure he does know the story forwards and backwards. There is quite a lot of research that Key Stage 4, as we've just been told, does impact back down the school, down into Key Stage 3, because of this heavy accountability that teachers feel because of the pressures of the high stakes of that assessment. But we're also now seeing that there's this strongly narrowed pool of texts that people are experiencing. So you can see the students are telling me that they're literally reading the same text year after year after year, which seems such a shame. There are so many books in the world, but you know, here we are reading the same things over and over again, apparently. The other comment there that really surprised me is that the library one next to it, that was another student, Emily, who was relating a story where teachers had been encouraging them to go to the library and widen their reading, but she says that when they got there weren't any different books there. They were just the same text that they were reading in class, which again seems a terrible waste of space, a waste of time. Yeah, that all seems really quite sad. And another thing that you'll see there is the idea of books for exams, and that reminded me a lot when I heard students saying this of Blymon's idea of exam English, that there's this kind of format of English that exists specifically for exams and isn't really in existence anywhere else. And the students were talking about books for exams. Emily, who also talked about the library story there, said that they read books that were for exams to put all the knowledge in the kids. That was her phrase. So this concept of books for exams was clearly the kind of kids' impression of the canon, I suppose, these particular books that exist specifically for exams. And all of this comes from the current iteration of GCSE literature that is very heavy on cultural capital and was very explicit about intending to give students access to cultural capital. Obviously, you know, this was well intentioned at the time. There was an idea that students were missing out, and you know, thinking about my FE students in particular, and everyone else's FE students, obviously, there is an idea that these are students who perhaps lack those opportunities. Many of my students will tell me that they don't have books at home, they weren't read to as children, so you know, perhaps there is an assumption that they would not have access to these things otherwise. But you know, when they're now telling me it's like all you read, and that they're genuinely not aware that other books exist. I've encountered students who thought people didn't write books anymore. They thought it all stopped quite a long time ago now, because they really haven't read anything in school that was written after, you know, 1950, some of them. So that all does seem quite a shame. Let me contextualize how I've conducted my study. So I told you already that my research is looking at young people's attitudes to diversity in their reading. I have looked at 2 different groups of participants. My pilot cohort were a group of Year 10s, so towards the end of Year 10, so they had, of course, had some experience of GCSE. And my main cohort is FE learners from my own college. So they are 16 to 19-year-olds. And as you can see there are a couple of key differences between those groups, both in terms of their free school meal entitlement and in terms of their attitude to, or their choices in terms of reading outside of education. I conducted surveys with both of those groups, and then with the FE group, I also conducted some follow-up interviews with a small number of those participants. So my main focus was on diversity. I'll just contextualise that a bit. So the set texts for GCSE don't really offer a lot of diversity. That was the perspective I went into this with, but I wanted to see what students felt. So I collected my data in the year 21 to 22, so just after the pandemic. So some of my FE learners hadn't really sat GCSE exams as such, whereas the year 10s were obviously just about to. According to the Lit in Colour data, which was collected pre-pandemic, under 1% of students at that time had been able to study a full-length text written by a person of colour, and 6 to 7% of them had been able to study a full-length text written by a woman. So way over 90% of them would have had a curriculum that was entirely white men. And yet, if you look at my data, most of the students, the FE students, were quite happy with the level of diversity of the text that they had studied. The pilot cohort, who were the ones reading outside the curriculum, were a bit more realistic about it. So they're the ones rating it, their average choice, their mean is 2 out of 10, and they're tapping out at 7 out of 10. Whereas the FE cohort go the full range, 0 to 10, and their mean choice is 5, which suggests that they're not really comfortable with this question. They don't really quite know what to do with it. I would remind you here that I'm conducting this research in Leicester, which is diverse. They are aware of diversity, and yet they don't really quite know what to do with it in this context. And I think that's largely because they actually don't think books are able to be diverse. They just don't think it's a possible thing. So they think the curriculum is as diverse as it possibly could be. The poetry was a little bit better. There were some diverse poems on the curriculum at that time. Again, that has got better since then, but we're still seeing that not many schools are taking up the diverse options of the longer texts because of those pressures of accountability, even where teachers are perhaps willing to pick up a more diverse modern text. Managers might not allow it because they'd be worried the results might dip. Resources aren't always available for students to revise from, even if they're available to teach from. So, you know, people get worried about that. So what we're seeing here in these results is that young people do seem to think that books are inherently pale, male and stale, particularly if they haven't already developed a reading habit. That's the problem. What GCSE is teaching them is that this is the nature of books. So in terms of reading, there are some specific issues for vocational learners, which is the nature of the students that we have in further education.
Beth, I think you've frozen. Can you hear us? Try and give Beth a minute to revive her her connection. Hi, Beth. Oh, what a shame! Just when she was, well, we just as we were, you know, fully invested in what it was that she was sharing with us and saying. Okay, I think if Beth can rejoin us, we will go with the rest of her presentation. We'll pick up where we left off. We're on slide 4 of 7. But until she gets back, perhaps I could invite Tara and Kalpa and Sarah to begin some dialogue. In relation to the presentations that you've just presented and what you've heard from each other. I mean, ideas that I picked up that might be of interest to you, but please go in your own direction if necessary, are the CPD, the support with the pedagogy, something that Sarah drove attention to, and that sort of speaks to all of your interests as well. And as I alluded to earlier, that notion of binaries and polarities, and we've sort of got some perspectives of people on two sides, or people and nature and humans. You know, we've got these opposites, and I know that your work is trying to draw these together and how we can further the efforts on that. So I will hand over to you just to pick up observations and themes there.
Yeah, I'll jump in then if you don't mind. No, I think you're quite right there. What you said about the kind of training for teachers, or even for trainee teachers. And one of the things for me when I started this research was that I was actually doing loads of stuff with trainee teachers that I work in, but then realizing that they're going into schools and they're not using the texts that I've been introducing them to because they don't have them in schools, and the teachers don't have that expertise or the same experiences. And I'm guessing that that's probably true with maybe some of the stuff that you're doing as well, in terms of that, connections with nature and text and outdoor learning. Again, things that we do with our trainee teachers, but then I go into schools and they're really restricted by what they can do. So yeah, I think that's a real issue.
Yeah, go for it, Tara.
Yeah, I mean, so on that, one of the approaches I took is we had so it was GRT month, like last June. And so one of our local schools contacted me because I'd worked with them before and said, hey, can we bring our GRT students? So, and they're all Romani background. Can we bring them to UE for a tour around UE? And I said, yes, and let's do a university English seminar. So we'll use Liljana's list. And then I sat them down at tables with my PGC English students. And so it was this wonderful dynamic where the students were teaching my PGC students a little bit more context around that story. So it was kind of on an even balance, whereas, my trainees were also like asking them some sort of literature analysis questions, and they were having that conversation. And then at the end of that, after that quite leveled playing field, I could then ask my PGC students, well, what did you learn from that? And what do you need to keep in mind as when you actually bring this story into schools? And it was very much about being humble, and not thinking that you can just, also knowing that there's going to be hugely varied experiences in terms of those students' language abilities, in terms of their feeling of connection to those stories. So don't make assumptions about where they're at. And don't be spotlighting people and expecting them to drop in like an expert to those conversations. But it's also about, as ourselves, we're supposed to have subject knowledge. So we need to do our background reading. We need to know appropriate language, how to use appropriate language around that. So I think that's really key.
I think the other thing as well that a lot of our trainees, it was kind of similar to what Beth was saying about they're reading the same thing and they're kind of falling out of love with reading. And so when they come to us, and I'm very conscious that we're kind of in this utopia of, higher education, and we've got this ideal, in an ideal world, this is what we would do. But when they're already kind of lost that love of literature, we're sort of trying to pump that back in, aren't we? Get them to love reading again, whilst also teaching them all of these pedagogies. And then they go into school and are trying to do what they can, but there are the tensions of actually what are school resources like, and what's the curriculum in that setting like, and what's the context like. There's all these layers, and they're just so new to it all, aren't they, our trainees? And so I'm really conscious that it's a lot for them to take on. And I guess my hope would be, with the pedagogies of hope, is that we're kind of getting them to start thinking, we're kind of planting the seed. And maybe one day, with some experience under their belt, they'll feel brave enough to kind of lead the way with some of these pedagogies that we're supporting them with, one hopes.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry.
I do get story, like they do go in, and I do take them out into nature, and we like eat wild garlic, and they haven't eaten wild garlic yet in their whole lives, and that really freaks them out, and we do some creative writing around it, and they do go straight into schools, and some of them have the resilience to fight through and to, you know, talk to the pastoral leads and arrange for the kids to leave campus and go and be amongst the trees for a bit and do some writing. And what they found is that it's totally transformative. Kids that don't normally engage love it. You know, they love going out and doing that. So it's really, really important, especially when there's that crossover with social justice, and there's some students that actually don't get that opportunity so often.
Yeah. One of the things that I wrote down when Beth was talking was that you don't know what you don't know. And I think that that's the thing with the young people that we're working with, whether that's a 19-year-old young person or whether it's a 7-year-old young person, they don't know that there are things missing in the texts that we're sharing with them because they're not deliberately looking for them. They get put off reading. They can't explain why they're not interested in reading. And yet, if you can find those texts that have all of that different representation in them that inspires them, they will enjoy reading. But because they don't know what they don't know or what they're missing, it's our job, it's teachers' jobs to introduce them to as much as they possibly can to kind of engage them in that, I think.
Absolutely, thank you. And it's also about then how, you know, that cross-fertilization within the teaching community. So many people on this call are teacher educators, so it's what we can do, and it's about sowing those seeds of hope, as Kalpa referred to, that, you know, they may not be able to use these ideas on their teaching practice or even in their ECT years, but as long as they're still there, as long as those, you know, those seeds are, you know, in seed banks ready to go when there's an opportunity, that's important. But it's also thinking about CPD for established teachers, and I think that came through really strongly in your presentation, Sarah, how people are renewing their ideas, the text that they teach in a very pressurized environment where they haven't got very much time to explore new things, and the school hasn't got very much money, and there's a nervousness about the curriculum, which was something else that Beth was alluding to, wasn't it? The lack of opportunities to be agentic, and the fear that actually, you know, goes around that. You have to be quite brave to be subversive, don't you? And brave to do things differently and change it up.
I think there's a phrase, isn't there, going round of, you know, the fidelity to the scheme or whatever it is, and there's that people are nervous to not read.
Well, there's sort of
that's what really came through in my research. The teachers knew what they needed to do. They knew, even could name books in which it would enable them to do it. They just didn't have the confidence to do it themselves. And it's almost like they needed, and that's why I kind of recommended that there needs to be some kind of training. They needed to have a conversation with somebody, or perhaps it's not a training course you go on. Perhaps it's more of a coaching approach, where they work with a teacher who has got the confidence to do that, who can demonstrate and model to them how you go about having those kind of tricky conversations with young children using books.
I'm just going to put something in the chat, but Sarah, have you read anything from Amy Saleh?
Yes, yeah, I have.
So I think her stuff, and she's got an article that's coming out soon. It's just been accepted in English and Education. But just for anybody who would like this is an excellent article to talk about teaching Black British literature. And her research is all around, you know, teaching Princess and the Hustler, and actually the CPD that she's designed that actually skills white teachers up for teaching these texts and making sure they do so with racial literacy. But this is an article that she published a couple of years ago, and it actually gets into the weeds of some of these issues. So it's just brilliant to share with teachers that you feel might benefit from it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's one of the differences in primary, is that sometimes teachers feel like they're not even sure whether they should be having those conversations, that actually that's a secondary kind of conversation to have. But, you know, you can have we need to begin these conversations with really young children. And that's where books are really great for doing that, because actually you're not having a conversation about any of the children in your class. You're talking about the characters from a story.
Going back to that notion of the key stages and the divides between them, are any of you, well, obviously Tara and Kalpa are very obviously involved in primary, secondary work between themselves, but can any of you speak to explicit examples of work done between primary and secondary teachers, secondary and FE teachers, to extend Beth's Beth's presentation, where those intersections are, because obviously that's another challenge, isn't it? And Beth was making that really explicit in terms of texts being repeated, but it goes beyond that as well, doesn't it? Tara's nodding. Go for it, Tara.
I just think, one of the first articles that I push on my PGC students is the Joe Westbrook study, the Just Reading, right? Because we know that actually more text and exposing to more text and not, force feeding them like all of these different quote explosions all the way through Romeo and Juliet, that's actually what has an impact on progress. And students feeling more confidence, especially to respond to exams with that extended personal conceptualized response. So we know this. And what makes me so furious is if you look at the national curriculum from 2014, it says explicitly the whole point of it is to ensure that students have a really diverse range of literature, that they read really widely. And that's exactly the opposite of what that curriculum has done. So I think we need to use that Westbrook study and push back against this and go, actually, there should be loads of books that they should be reading at least 2 novels every year in Key Stage 3, and why do we drop that in FE? Why do we suddenly just narrow it right down? I mean, we know, but it's not a research informed approach.
I'll add something if that's okay. I was just literally before this this meeting, I was in the Reading for Pleasure partnership development session with the Open University. And some people were talking in that group about how even within Key Stage 2, texts that we would have read with sort of upper Key Stage 2 are being pushed lower and lower down the key stage. And we've got, Year 3 children reading texts that we would have read in Year 6. And whilst, yes, we absolutely need to have high expectations and everything that goes with that, how many themes are being missed because these are themes that those younger children are, it's, for some of them, it's going to go above their heads. They're quite complex and they're quite challenging in that way. And are they ready for those sorts of conversations? And are the teachers ready for those sorts of conversations with such young pupils? So there's that as well. That's kind of, just something to add to the mix there of other practice that's going on.
Yeah,
absolutely. That reminds me. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think you're right, because one of the things I was also thinking when Beth was talking, when she was talking about Romeo and Juliet being done in Key Stage 3 and in Key Stage 4, it's also done in Key Stage 2 quite often. I've seen primary teachers, not the original text, obviously, that's not accessible for younger children, but versions of Romeo and Juliet are often taught in Year 5 and Year 6. So actually somebody could, from Key Stage 2 all the way through to the end of Key Stage 4, be studying Romeo and Juliet, which it's too much, really, isn't it?
I'm going to see Romeo and Juliet tonight at the Bristol Old Vic. Looks like a fabulous production with rap music in it, but that's an aside. And you've just reminded me of Michael Gove. Once upon a time, was recommending Lord of the Flies as a Key Stage 2 text because it was just about boys playing on a beach, wasn't it? Sort of thing. So again, the inappropriateness. But wonderful. We've begun to get some questions in the chat. So thank you, Andrew, for getting things going. I think let's now invite colleagues to join in the discussion, rather than hogging it to ourselves as we have been doing. So let's go with Andrew's question. Sarah, you talked about inappropriate text suggestions on social media, and that was a really interesting example that you gave. Where teachers are looking to introduce more diverse text, and let's hope everyone is, and feel they have the space, have you got any evidence of where teachers are going for guidance on this? So how can they sort of solve that social media conundrum that you've introduced us to?
Yeah, so actually one of the teachers that I interviewed talked about how she was using Instagram, and it was a particular Instagram account. I think it's just called Diverse Kids Books or something like that. And it was somebody on Instagram who just, a few times a week posts a recommendation of a diverse children's book. And I actually contacted the person that runs that account to find out who they were, because I was just curious as to who was running this account. And it was a teacher who, I think she was on maternity leave. Obviously, twiddling her thumbs, nothing to do while you're on maternity leave, decided to set up this. So that was like an individual teacher who was kind of doing that themselves. But teachers also talked about, there's a website called inclusive children's books, I think it's called, and there's one called Diverse Books for Kids, which is set in the USA. But they also talked about Books for Topics, which is a website that matches children's books, children's literature to kind of different topics that you might teach in primary. And they also talked about the Black curriculum as well, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with, it's it's not just focused on the teaching of English, it's focused on teaching across the curriculum, primary and secondary. So those were some of the specific websites that that teachers mentioned to me in their research that they were using.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. So let's open up for further questions. I don't know whether anybody is feeling brave enough to put their hand up and ask a question that way, or please do add another question to the chat. Hey, Hazel's got a question. Have you got rid of Inspectacles and of Mice and Men yet? I don't know who the you is there. I don't know to whom that question is specifically addressed, Hazel. My goodness me, we're trying though. And certainly in terms of my practice at Bristol, Mice and Men went out a long time ago. In terms of Inspectacles, I think that we're very much advocating that sort of both and approach. So we're looking at a text that people are using a lot in school, but actually spending very little time on that, spending a lot of time on texts like The Empress by Tanika Gupta and the Princess and the Hustler that Tara has alluded to earlier on. So really, demonstrating pedagogy about what teaching a Key Stage 4 play text could be like in a very active way, and embracing those texts and sharing practice through those texts rather than focusing in our sessions on Inspectacles. Having said that, most of my student teachers are going into schools and teaching Inspectacles, hopefully though with the pedagogies that we've been introducing. Hazel, you've got a question, so do dive in and continue this.
Well, I suppose, I mean, that was a bit facetious, because I think I remember doing that when they brought in CSEs alongside the GCE to see how we did. And my children are in their 40s, early 40s, and they did it. And I was talking to a teenager in the local park, and they're still doing it. And I think some of the question really is, once a school gets a set of texts, at what point and the teachers know them, at what point do people set them aside and buy new sets of texts that the school can use? That's, because it seemed to be like they had 30 copies of this in the school. And so there was just no question of moving forward onto something new. Are you coming across that?
Resourcing is a really big issue, Hazel, I have to say, and as is teacher confidence and a perception that teachers know the ropes, so to speak, with exams, with those key exam texts, and there's pressure from above not to take the risk in changing them. Examiners know those texts very well as well, and so there's a requirement on examiners to know these new texts, and we can't necessarily rely on that. So there are good reasons for conservative with the small c teachers to continue to use what they know and what they feel confident with. But I'll hand over to colleagues to develop that those points. I don't know whether Tara or Kappa or Sarah, you've got anything to add to that. Okay, all right. That's a bit of an answer for you, Hazel, then. Thank you so much to Mark, who's added some BFI resources to the chat. That's fantastic, brilliant. Any other questions or observations that colleagues who are listening in would like to pose to any of our speakers? Thank you, Kalpa. Is the BL Learning back up again? I know that British Library had a lot of trouble, didn't it, with after hacking and been slowly rebuilding itself. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, they have. We tend to have somebody from the British Library who does a session with our undergraduates in their first year to kind of talk through some of that resourcing. So they are slowly getting back on track, and they have got things up. So might just be another great place to have a look for some resources that you think are relevant.
Thank you. Just while we wait for somebody else to be brave enough to pop a question in the chat or to put their hand up then, could we return to the point about representation and the accuracy of representation and how we can support how as our profession is predominantly white as English teachers, how we can support white English teachers feel more confident about about working with texts that they with an ethnicity that's different to their own. Go Tara.
I think we have to think about who's in our classrooms. And I think part of this is, one of the reasons we're in this position is because there's been such a focus on, teacher-centered, explicit teaching, sat in rows, kind of English teaching, right? And the reason we're in that position is because we are being forced to teach stuff like Victorian novels, where it's a lot harder to engage the students in our classroom because it doesn't really speak to their lived experience, right? So it's harder to get them engaged, and we have to do a lot of talking at them about context and about language in those texts. So I think that's a major issue. And so now then we're teaching these texts that, depending on who we have in our classroom, actually might really speak to them and might open up a lot of discussion, but we're still in this mode of teaching from the front. And some work that I've done before with an ECT that I was mentoring before I left school a couple of years ago is we focused on decentering the white teacher and moving towards more cooperative learning strategies, which is great for oracy, obviously, but also for social and emotional learning. And what we found is we could get a room of 32 year sevens, and we had them trained up within 6 weeks where we could go, right, class discussion, and that was good. And they were turn taking 32 students, listening to each other at a time, turn taking really well, responding to each other, building on each other's comments, questioning each other. And we used that with the EMC anthology, Diverse Shorts. And the conversations that those students had were absolutely magnificent, and it translated into their writing as well. So I think part of it is about, okay, we'll be clued up about what we're teaching, but part of it is learning when to step back and empower your students.
Great, thank you. And I've been doing some work recently actually as well with using objects, photographs, pictures, that type of thing, to present to students as prompts for discussion and dialogue that also can generate really, really rich discussion. Because it's slightly different, I guess, because there's a different prompt in front of them, because they can interact with it in a different way. Everybody can say something about a picture. Everybody's got an in. It's analysis that, in a different way. Andrew, thank you. Tara, in terms of GCSE, have you seen evidence of the change for more diverse literature in the exam text having an impact in secondary classrooms?
Yes, absolutely. So definitely follow Amy Saleh's work, and also Vicky Elliott's work as well. So, there is with Pearson I know is running a project where they're actually going to be following GCSE results and supporting schools that are taking on texts like Princess and the Hustler and poetry anthologies like Worlds and Lives. So schools are absolutely doing that, but it's very piecemeal, the schools that are picking it up. And in Bristol, we have a few schools doing that because Amy's working directly with those schools to skill them up. And that's what we need, I think, for schools to feel like they're part of a community who's getting a support network. Because I know as a teacher, I taught inspector calls because there was a 6-week scheme of work that went with it. And when I was entering that classroom, I didn't want to be making, I didn't want to teach that play. I really didn't. But I didn't want to let my department down. So if we produce really good resources, which Amy's done with a brilliant group of Black teachers from across the country to produce those resources, then we know we're getting resources that have that racial literacy built into them. And that's really helpful. So yes, absolutely, it's happening, but we need the resources, we need the racial literacy, and we also need that support of, local support of a community of educators that are all doing it together.
I think we also need schools to look back at what's going on within that setting, what's going on in my school, what does policy say in this school, what message are we giving out there, and really look inward a little bit and make those conscious steps of, okay, well, let's be honest about what we're doing here, and then let's move on from that. It's hard to do one thing without doing that groundwork and putting in the effort in terms of the foundations of that school, really.
And in terms of thinking about that sort of more systemically, perhaps it's a matter of schools working within academy chains and MATs, etc., working between them rather than as well as within them. And that actually brings us back to our theme of across the divides, doesn't it? I don't know whether any of you know of schools within multi-academy trusts that are making an active effort to work with each other across subject. So we have got sort of literacy leads in primary working with Key Stage 3 English colleagues and people at Key Stage 4 working up with Key Stage 5. Have you got any evidence of that happening within within organisations in which schools sort of find themselves now? And anybody in the chat, if anyone in the audience, if you know of any interactions like that going on within the structures, please do shout as well. So just I'll put that question to the panel to start with, but please let's broaden that out if necessary.
I don't have any evidence, I'll just say that right now. I have not seen anything like that yet. And within our academies trusts, I guess what I am seeing is this is the scheme that we're working from. So that's what we're doing. That's my primary perspective and what I'm seeing so far. That might change, but yeah, that's my view.
Thanks, Sarah.
I do know of two schools that work well. It's a school that used to be two schools, a secondary and a primary school, but they've now become an all-through school. So they've obviously got the same head teacher who's kind of overseeing everything, and they're doing some really good work on, that kind of linking the Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 curriculum in particular, which obviously makes sense that all schools really should be doing that, but they're able to do it because actually it's now an all-through school and they've realised that they've absolutely got to do it. But other than that, again, it's not something that I've seen many schools doing, unfortunately.
And that's an opportunity lost, isn't it? Maybe once we, as the curriculum and assessment review does further work, there'll be more voices to ensure that we don't get this sort of overlaps and repetition between the key stages. And so we're offering our students and young people the opportunities to read widely and diversely and across themes, and to develop their own passions and interests and share those and have arguments and disputes and discussions and all sorts of things. Okay, are there any further questions or observations? Oh, Sarah, thank you, Hazel. Sarah, so do you think that the coincidence of books representative of different races having female protagonists in part suggests that publishers think they're covering two issues with one book? That's interesting. Or is it to do with the authors themselves, etc.? So yeah, is that box ticking in terms of, right, okay, we'll sort the feminists and we'll sort the racial diversity in one fell swoop?
It very well may be, because obviously there's been a huge amount of, over the last few years, there's been a huge amount of talk about diversity, particularly young children's texts, with the Reflecting Realities research that the CLPE have done. They've done a lot of campaigning with publishers, and so the amount of books being published with children or characters from racially minoritized backgrounds has really increased over the last kind of 6 or 7 years. But what has happened in many of those cases is that it's not good representation, particularly in picture books. It is often just a case of the characters have just been coloured in a different colour. So there's not necessarily high quality representation in picture books. So there may be a case of that, actually. Okay, we need more female representation. We need more racially minoritized representation. Let's just make a load of books about black girls. I don't think it's necessarily the authors or the illustrators, because several of those books were written and illustrated by men. And it might be that they're out there, and it's just the teachers are choosing the books with female characters. It's something that I think I'd like to kind of look more into, actually. And I think most, when I talk to teachers and they recommend books to me, they do tend to be those with female characters in them. And maybe it's the female heavy nature of the teaching profession as well.
Really good point. Thank you, Hazel. That's a great question as well. Okay, colleagues, I think at 10 to 6 we'll begin to draw things to a close. I'd like to thank our 4 presenters hugely, and what a shame that Beth is not here to be thanked, because I was really interested in her presentation until she sadly had to disappear. But really stimulating afternoon. And I hope that you'll be further stimulated through the English in Education SIG. On the 11th of July, we've got an in-person event here at the University of Bristol. I'm just popping oh no, that's the wrong link. I was going to pop the wrong link in the chat there. Thank you, John. I was just about to do that, but you've beaten me to it. Amazing. We have an event actually which sort of builds on Tara and Kalpa's work in terms of the trees, at least. We're exploring the potential of secondary English to support sustainability and climate change education and prepare citizens for the future. So, nuanced ambitions there. But the call for papers is now open, so please do respond to that. We'd be really delighted for you to join us in Bristol, and we're hoping for people coming from all over the country for that, and we hope that the weather will be as glorious on the 11th of July in Bristol as it has been today, and we can get outside, and we're actively hoping to use our local we're grateful for the tree-lined spaces that we have around us for some active workshopping. But thank you once again, everybody, for coming, for being here, for giving up your time, and Sarah, Tara, Kalpa, and Beth, very many thanks. Farewell, everyone, and have a great evening. Bye-bye.